All right, good morning, AP Governors. It is Thursday, April 9th, and today we are going to spend our time wrapping up the Unit 1 review that we started on Tuesday. So all of you guys, if you're keeping pace with what we're doing, today you'll have finished all 55, 56, whatever they are, all items. And if you have me for class this semester, please follow the instructions as far as turning it in that I gave you in the written portion of the Google Classroom today of today's instructions. So turn that in and kind of keep pace with everything as we work our way through. Next week, we'll do the same thing with Unit 2. At some point during this weekend, either tomorrow, all right, or you'll see it early Saturday morning, I will put a quizzes review or Quizlet review online for you to kind of do a practice just of all the Unit 1 review items we had. That'll be there. You can do that kind of whenever you want. That's an optional thing, but hopefully it's there for you to help kind of review and just kind of feel comfortable with the material as we head towards the AP exam. So without further ado, let's get right to that Unit 1.1 review document. You've got your PDF opened up of the foundational documents, so you've got it open up to the United States Constitution, and you have the Unit 1 review doc itself. Remember, if I'm going too fast for you, pause the video, type in your answers, and or write in your answers, and resume when you're ready. So this unit is the foundations of the American democracy. So we left off on unit or part of 1.7, which gets into that relationship between the state and the federal government. So really what this entire discussion, to wrap up this, is on federalism here. And so we start with the beginning in item 31, the definition of federalism itself. Federalism is a system of government in which the central government, or the national government, shares power with the state and local governments over the same people. That it's a system of government in which power is shared between different levels of government, unlike in a confederate system where the power was all at the state level, or unitary system where it's all at the national level. And within our system of federalism, then, what it's really about is trying to define is, okay, how are those powers shared? Who has which powers? And so that takes us to this idea of enumerated powers as compared to implied powers. All right, enumerated powers are powers that are specifically listed in the United States Constitution. And we can find those powers that are specifically listed in the United States Constitution for Congress, all right? Those powers that Congress has specifically listed, we can find those powers in Article 1 and Section 8. So if I go to Article 1, Section 8, Article 1, Section 8 is the powers of Congress. And you've got this grocery list of a variety of different things that specifically Congress has the power to do. All of these things here are the enumerated powers. Congress shall have the power to collect taxes, to regulate commerce, to coin money. Those are examples of enumerated powers. The power to declare war is an example of an enumerated powers. Those things vary from what are referred to as, in question 33, implied powers. Implied powers are powers that Congress possesses that are not specifically listed within the United States Constitution. All right, and that takes us kind of that next question. Though that idea of where do these powers come from, what clause gives them the powers, that comes from the final clause. It's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. The last clause in the United States Constitution's Article 1, Section 8 says the following here. Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. It is this clause that gives them those implied powers, all right? And again, an implied power is a power that's not specifically listed, but one that the United States Congress has the ability to stretch the description of the enumerated powers to a much further degree. For example, the Congress is given the power, enumerated power, to coin money and to regulate commerce. All right. As a result of that, they decided, hey, we have to create a national bank. The Supreme Court agreed, hey, yes, they're stretching that power, all right, but it helps them fulfill the enumerated powers that are listed in the Constitution. So that's what implied powers are. All right. On the other hand, you can also look in the Constitution and see what kind of powers the president has. Now, we will notice and recognize what kind of powers the President of the United States has by going into Article 2 of the United States Constitution. most of those powers that the president possesses truly are implied powers. In other words, they're not specifically listed. There are some specifically listed powers, and I'll show you those in a second here, but most of them are just the implied powers of the presidency. It's referred to as the vesting clause. And so I'm going to show that to you in Article 2 here in 2 seconds. If you kind of flip to Article 2, all right, Article 2, Section 1 simply begins by saying the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. These are the implied powers of the president. The executive power, all right, is referred to as the implied powers or the vested powers or vesting powers in the executive branch. And because there is not clarity on exactly what that means, and so the president's able to stretch that in regards to how does he enforce the law, how does he execute the role of the federal government, all right, that is able to be stretched dramatically depending upon who's in office. Now, that being said, and I'll go back to the document in a second, there are, as you continue along in Article 2, Section 2, there are some specific enumerated powers of the executive office. All right, the president shall be commander-in-chief. Boom, it's specifically listed. He has the power to grant reprieves and pardons. All right, he has the power to, with the advice and consent of Senate, all right, negotiate treaties. So there are some things that are enumerated, but much of what the president can do and does do is referred to as implied. Okay, and so that kind of shows us some of the difference in regards to the powers that the federal government possesses through the different branches of government. So really what federalism is about the relationship between the powers the federal government has and what the state government has. All right, the state governments have what are known as reserved powers, and those reserved powers can be found in the 10th Amendment. Right, I'm not going to show that one to you today because I think you've seen it enough. If you look at the 10th Amendment says that all powers not specifically delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states and their people. All right, so those things that aren't formally given to the federal government are therefore reserved for the states. Right, and we look at some examples of things like that. The states are in charge of conducting elections. All right, the states are in charge of deciding if gambling is going to be legal. What age somebody has to be to drink. Is recreational marijuana going to be legal? Those things are reserved powers. Many times, a lot of those morality issues involving the creation of schools, those things are reserved powers left up to the states. Right? So you have powers that are enumerated or delegated to the federal government. You have powers that are reserved for the states, exclusive to the states. And you also have, in question 37 here, we get this idea, remember, of concurrent powers. Concurrent powers are powers that they both possess. So within our system of federalism, both the federal government and the state government, for example, they can both tax you. They can both make their own laws. They can enforce their own laws. Those things are examples of types of powers that are concurrent powers. And so as we look at it, we're really trying to figure out how have our different levels of government, how have they worked these different powers in this system, how have they worked together through this. So if you remember throughout the semester, we talked about two different kinds of federalism. We talked about dual federalism and cooperative federalism. So question 38 asks you to define what dual federalism is. All right, and dual federalism was really only prominent during the early days of our republic, and as more presidents took office and started to expand kind of their implied powers, and Congress expanded their implied powers, we've moved away from dual federalism. But simply first, remember, dual federalism was that layer cake idea. All right, a layer cake is this idea where you can, under dual federalism, you could clearly separate and visibly see which powers are of the federal government, which ones are the states. They didn't blur together. Right, there was really clarity into who was in charge of what. Right? That started to change as the federal government started to expand its powers, and we moved from dual federalism to what's referred to as cooperative federalism. And first off, as a definition, cooperative federalism is a system of government in which what the federal government has the power over and what the state governments have the power over, those things start to blend together or blur together. And so we use the analogy of a marble cake in which you can't separate the chocolate and the vanilla portions of the cake, and those are the federal powers and the state powers moving together, right? And with cooperative federalism, what you get is you get shared responsibilities, right? You get shared costs, shared administration, and you really get more federal guidelines. All right, this started to become more and more prominent really since since Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase, right? And we had some Supreme Court rulings in the early 1800s, but really the greatest level of prominence is most oftentimes tracked back or traced back to FDR's presidency and the New Deal and the growth from that time period. Right? We can see it happening way before then, but oftentimes people point to FDR as really pushing this forward. But we can look at the Civil War as a greater example also of a movement towards cooperative federalism. And really, what cooperative federalism leads to is this blurring, but it also leads oftentimes to an increased role of the federal government within our government, more and more power. And a lot of that is due in large part because of the financial resources the federal government has at its disposal compared to what the states have. And so we move next to this discussion on fiscal federalism. And so fiscal federalism is an analysis of the financial relationship between the states and the federal governments. And a few different things have been done that have changed the balance of power between these different levels of government. And so we'll go through each one of these ones in this chart that is created for you. The first one was revenue sharing. Revenue sharing was a system that was common during the early 1980s and it ended in 1986, in which the federal government would collect their revenue, right? And they would set a large portion on their side and say, okay, we're just going to distribute portions of this to the states. So California's got 30% of the population. We're going to give them 30% of the revenue to spend as they see fit. There were no strings attached at all to this. All right, you just got a large chunk of money from the federal government. Every state got a slice of the revenue pie, and they had the ability to do whatever they wanted with it. All right, as a result of that, through the use of revenue sharing, the powers of the state and the local governments increased dramatically relative to the federal government because they had complete control over how they would spend the money and what they would spend it on. Right? That came into an end in 1986 when many times in the federal government they just felt that the states were being inefficient in what they were doing with the money. And so what we've seen grow, and this has been going on before the end of revenue sharing, but we've seen this growth of mandates and other types of grants and mandates and grants and aid. And what a mandate is when the federal government provides some kind of requirement to the states through a law, through some type of bureaucratic legislation. It could go to a state, a local community, a school, a business. And what mandates are, and unfunded mandates specifically, are these requirements that you have to follow without any financial assistance to help get them done. An example I can remind you of is like the Americans with Disabilities Act, in which businesses and local communities and state governments have to make reasonable accommodations for those persons with disabilities. They have to make those changes to their buildings and in the workplace. They get no financial assistance, right? So that's an example of an unfunded mandate. Again, unlike revenue sharing, this increases the power of the federal government relative to the states because the federal governments are telling the states and the people in those states exactly what they have to do with some of their money. Right? So that makes the federal government more powerful, as does the use of categorical grants. A categorical grant, if you remember, is a grant in which federal money is distributed to the local or the state level, and that grant comes with a great deal of strings attached to it. All right, the money has to be spent in a very specific way for a specific purpose. For example, the example I give you on the chart, you could send money to the school district, like School District 200, that can only be used for a specific grade, for a specific income group of students, for a specific subject area. For example, you can't use money we give you money I talked about like for reading, but that money can only be used for preschool age, Title I students, all right? In your school district. You can't use that to improve the reading skills or the mathematical skills of high school kids or any kids you wanted to. You have to use it on a very specific purpose. Again, like mandates, categorical grants make the federal governments more powerful than the states or relative to the states because they're telling them exactly what they have to do with the money. If they don't follow the rules, they lose the money. One other type of grant and aid is referred to as block grants. Right? Block grants are different from categorical grants. Block grants are monies that are given to states, but states have a greater level of flexibility, or local communities, businesses have a greater level of flexibility how they spend that money. And so it might just be money. So District 200 might just qualify for a block educational grant, and they can use that from whatever they want. They can use that to develop reading skills, mathematical skills, testing skills, all right, online learning environments, all right. It provides more flexibility with a block grant relative to a categorical grant. And as a result of that, as you give more block grants out, the states gain power relative to the federal government within the system of federalism because they are deciding how they're going to spend the money. Right? Stereotypically, this would be more of a conservative idea, handing more power back to the states, or really giving less responsibilities to the federal government. Right? As we move on, the next chart kind of gets into some other constitutional foundations for the federalism relationships. And we first start with a couple different amendments. The 10th Amendment we already talked about reserves powers for the states. Right? Recognizing this, that also influences. The 10th Amendment is that trump card that the states will throw down within a court system, within some kind of conflict, to say, listen, we have our own level and we have to maintain this balance of power appropriately to reserve what is our powers. You have to say to what is delegated to you. Right? Another amendment that has influenced the balance of power, right, really shifting more power, generally speaking, towards the federal government, has been the addition of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment we'll look into a lot more within our Unit 3. All right, but reminder of the 14th Amendment, we have the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. Both of these clauses have been used through the United States Supreme Court and through Congress to allow the federal government to encroach in the lives of the state governments through the Due Process Clause, through the incorporation process, and telling states that they have to ensure that all people have these different liberties and protections under the Bill of Rights, that they have to have those things protected. Through the Equal Protection Clause, the federal government, through laws and through court cases, have told the states that you have to treat everyone equally under the law. And so they've promoted equality, they've promoted due process under the expansion of the 14th Amendment and the interpretation of the 14th Amendment. A couple clauses that have or are used in relation to this relationship between the federal and state governments and federalism are the Commerce Clause. First off, you can find that in Article 1, Section 8. I highlighted it earlier, okay, and showed that to you. In Article 1, Section 8, it says Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. Any commerce that basically involves more than one state, any commerce that involves a foreign nation, that commerce is regulated by the United States Congress. Again, that increases the power of the federal government relative to the states. The states can only deal with things within their economy that do not involve other states within the commercial activity. The Necessary and Proper Clause, we looked at that one earlier, so you already know what that is. The Necessary and Proper Clause is another example of a part of the Constitution that makes the federal government stronger, because as Congress starts to expand, and if the Supreme Court allows this expansion to occur, all right, what kind of implied powers they have, Congress can take more and more powers, all right, as they assume more powers. That makes the strength of the state governments and what they have control over narrower and narrower, all right. In a similar way, we look at that Supremacy Clause. And the Supremacy Clause brings us to and takes a look at, in Article, we will find this in Article 6. Okay, so if you go to Article 6, you've already got this one highlighted in your foundational documents. It says three things: that the supreme law of the land is the United States Constitution, federal laws, and United States treaties. All three of those things, all right, and if we think about this as, again, as in terms of the balance of power, they make the federal government stronger relative to the states because all three of those things, constitutionally speaking, legally speaking, trump the state constitutions and state laws. So no state constitution or state law can go against a U.S. Constitution or federal laws or federally created treaties. All right. Finally, to wrap up the discussion on the foundations of democracy in this federalism discussion, we have two court cases. All right. The first required court case was McCulloch v. Maryland. All right. The first thing we should be able to do about these things, and question 50 gets to this, is talk about the facts of the case. What was going on in McCulloch v. Maryland is the federal government had created a national bank to the displeasure of many of the states. As a result, some of the states, they didn't like that Congress had created this national bank. States like Maryland had hoped to get rid of these national banks, so they started to tax the national bank that existed within their state borders, right? And the federal government refused to pay the tax. So that's the facts of what was going on in McCullough, Maryland in 1819, right? Within that, the court ruled that the states did not have the power to tax the federal government. They also ruled that the federal government had the power to create the national bank, through Congress. And so this gave extraordinary strength to two clauses in the expansion of the federal power relative to the states, because the Supreme Court invoked the Supremacy Clause. All right, states can't tax the federal government, and they invoked the Necessary and Proper Clause. Congress has the right to create the bank, all right, even though it's not specifically listed. And so those things help to grow the power of the federal government. And generally speaking, the Supreme Court has continued to expand the power of the federal government through these two clauses time and time again over the last couple hundred years. There have been a couple exceptions to that. And that gets us to our last case and some of the last comments here that we've got on this is we get to the United States versus Lopez case from the mid-1990s. Right, so what was going on? The facts of the case in U.S. v. Lopez. Some kid, all right, this is good old Texas, brought a gun to high school, senior year in Texas. All right, he was arrested in violation of a state law. All right, that case or that was dropped. All right, but he was then also charged under a federal law known as the Gun-Free Zone Act. All right, Gun-Free School Zone Act of 1990. That law forbid the sale and the possession of gun within a certain radius of any schools. And so this kid's arrested under this federal law. All right, Congress had created this law under the belief that the Commerce Clause gave them the power to regulate commercial activity, and that the sale and possession of guns, they believed, was commercial activity. Right? Going to summarize this, all right, in question 53 here, what the Supreme Court said, what they ruled in this was that Congress had overstepped its bounds by using the Commerce Clause, right, to justify the passage of this law. In their ruling, the impact of this, what the Supreme Court said was, if we're going to suggest that this is commercial activity, there is no element of the economy that would not fall under interstate commerce, that Congress would not have authority over. And so there have to be some restrictions placed upon where Congress can intervene or not intervene within the economic lives of the states independently. And so this kid in this was able to, all right, in theory, all right, carry the gun because the law itself and this portion of the law was declared unconstitutional. And so some last kind of points here in regards to is the impact of federalism in action here. So the last three questions, all right, first off in question 54, sorry for bouncing around there. It asks you, how does public education show the complexity of federalism? Okay, and first off, let me just kind of address this one individually. What we get out of federalism, some of the benefits that we get out of federalism is individual states can prioritize what they believe is truly important. Creating schools is a reserved power, and so that some states can really invest in and create extraordinary educational opportunities for their students. Right? Part of the complexities that come out of this, though, are other states might decide, you know what, public education, who cares about it? And they don't put a lot of money in. And some of their educational systems represent the lack of concern that they have and the dollars that they put into the system itself. And so in some parts of this country, right, the quality of education can vary extraordinarily based upon what the states do. And that's one of the problems we get out of this. Right? Also within that complexity, as we become more cooperative federalism in the way we handle our government, right, the federal government starts to come in and they start to put rules and regulations upon states if they take money from them. And so that creates a more complicated environment. And really, we can see this taking place in a variety of other issues. All right, question 55 talks about the complexities of marijuana. Right, in regards to federalism. Some states have legalized it, and so it's legal in Colorado, but it's not legal in Nebraska. So if somebody drives across, right, the state lines, right, the complexity that comes is a law enforcement question. Right, somebody travels from Colorado to another state where it's not legal. All right, the federal government has classified it as illegal, and so if they're traveling on that plane, they're in illegal possession of it, and so we get lots of issues in regards to law enforcement and economic rights in regards to the issues of federalism and things like marijuana. Those things continue in the last question in a variety of countless other issues. You can think of issues like the death penalty, all right, where some states use the death penalty, some states don't. All right, are people really being treated equally under the law? Are their due process rights really the same if the death penalty is good in one state and not good in another? All right, that's part of the complexities. You can look at things like same-sex marriage laws, in which some states at some point legalized it, others didn't. And then all of a sudden the federal government comes in through the Supreme Court ruling and saying, no, it's got to be legal everywhere. So there's lots of examples. You can think of sanctuary cities, and where you get this conflict between local communities and states and the federal government. The federal government wants to go after and hunt down any illegal alien under the Trump administration, and a lot of cities want to protect all the illegal immigrants in their city. And you get these sanctuary cities, and you get this battle and this conflict between the different levels of government. So that's what we get a lot of times within our system of federalism. We get some of those problems to develop and exist. So hopefully I'm helping you out with a Unit 1 review. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, and I hope to see you guys soon. Take care.